Miss Grace Thornton had long ago accepted that she would never be the heroine of her own love story, her 24 years having been shaped by the quiet understanding that women without dowries, without family connections, and without the glittering accomplishments that society demanded were destined to remain in the shadows, while others claimed the spotlight and the hearts of worthy gentlemen. Born to a country vicar who had died when she was 16, leaving behind nothing but debts, and a daughter whose only inheritance was an excellent education and an unshakable moral compass, Grace had spent the last 8 years working as a companion to elderly ladies and governess to merchant families' children, moving from household to household like a ghost who served faithfully but was never truly seen or valued for anything beyond her usefulness. She possessed a quiet beauty that went unnoticed in a world that prized dramatic loveliness, soft brown hair that caught golden highlights in the sunlight, warm hazel eyes that reflected a soul untouched by cynicism despite years of disappointment, and delicate features that spoke to gentle breeding even when clothed in the simple grey wool that marked her station as clearly as any uniform. Her figure was slender and graceful, moving through the world with the unconscious elegance of someone who had been taught proper deportment, but had learned to make herself invisible to avoid drawing unwanted attention from employers who might mistake kindness for presumption or beauty for availability. At 24, Grace had convinced herself that she was content with her lot in life, that the love stories she read in stolen moments were fantasies meant for other women, women with fortunes and families and the kind of dazzling beauty that stopped men in their tracks and made them forget their obligations to marry within their own social sphere. She had learned to find satisfaction in small kindnesses, in the gratitude of the children she taught, in the rare moments when an elderly employer treated her with genuine warmth rather than distant politeness, and in the books that transported her to worlds where love conquered all obstacles and every worthy heart found its perfect match. But fate, as Grace would discover on a rain-soaked afternoon in November 1819, had no respect for her carefully managed expectations or her resigned acceptance of a life lived on the margins of other people's happiness. Duke Edward Ravenshire, 32 years old, and possessed of the kind of commanding presence that made other men step aside and women flutter behind their fans, had built his reputation on his keen intelligence, his unwavering integrity, and his ability to see through the elaborate pretenses that characterized London society to the truth that lay beneath. Tall and powerfully built, with dark hair that showed no grey despite the weight of responsibilities he had carried since inheriting his title at 21, and steel blue eyes that seemed to penetrate every facade and pretense, Edward had grown increasingly weary of the endless parade of fortune-hunting beauties and calculating families who saw him not as a man, but as a prize to be won through whatever means necessary. He had watched his peers marry for convenience and alliance, had seen the hollow emptiness that characterized unions built on mutual advantage rather than genuine affection, and had sworn that he would rather remain unmarried than settle for a partnership that offered nothing more than social acceptability and the production of heirs to carry on the family name. It was this very weariness with society's shallow machinations that had driven him to seek refuge in the countryside, accepting an invitation to visit his old friend Lord Pemberton at his estate in Derbyshire, where he hoped to find some respite from the relentless pressure to marry and the suffocating atmosphere of London's marriage mart. He had no way of knowing that this retreat from society would lead him directly into the path of a woman who would challenge every assumption he had made about love, worth, and the true meaning of nobility, a woman whose lack of fortune would prove to be the very thing that made her infinitely more valuable than all the wealthy heiresses who had tried to capture his attention. The meeting that would change both their lives forever took place in the library of Pemberton Hall, where Grace had been sent to retrieve a book for her current employer, Lady Pemberton's elderly aunt, who had taken a fancy to Gothic novels and required someone to read aloud to her during the long afternoon hours when her arthritis made it impossible for her to hold a book herself. Grace entered the magnificent library with the quiet efficiency that characterized all her movements, her simple grey dress marking her as a servant, even as her natural grace and the intelligence evident in her hazel eyes suggested depths that most people never bothered to explore. She was reaching for a volume on a high shelf when the leather-bound tome slipped from her grasp, tumbling toward the floor where it would surely be damaged, only to be caught by strong hands that appeared as if from nowhere, belonging to a man whose very presence seemed to fill the vast library with an energy that made Grace's pulse quicken in ways she had never experienced before. "Careful," Edward said, his voice deep and warm as he steadied both the book and Grace herself, who had stumbled slightly in her attempt to catch the falling volume. "These old books are irreplaceable, and I suspect Lady Pemberton would not be pleased if one of her treasures came to harm." Grace looked up into steel blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, the carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart began to crumble under the intensity of his gaze and the unexpected kindness in his voice. "Thank you, sir," she managed to say, though her voice came out as barely more than a whisper as she struggled to process the fact that this magnificent man, clearly a gentleman of the highest rank, judging by his expensive clothing and aristocratic bearing, was looking at her not with the dismissive indifference she had grown accustomed to receiving from his class, but with genuine interest and waiche, that appeared to be admiration. "I'm afraid I was careless. I should have asked for assistance rather than attempting to reach such a high shelf on my own." Edward found himself studying her face with an intensity that surprised him, noting the intelligence that sparkled in her hazel eyes, the natural grace with which she carried herself despite her obvious embarrassment, and the quiet dignity that seemed to radiate from her very being like light from a carefully tended flame. Here was a woman who possessed something that all the celebrated beauties of London society lacked: authenticity, genuine warmth, and a strength of character that had clearly been tested by circumstances but had emerged unbroken and uncompromised. "Edward Ravensmoor," he said, offering a bow that was far more respectful than Grace had any right to expect, given the obvious disparity in their stations. "And you are?" The simple question hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning two different worlds, offering Grace a choice that would determine the course of her entire future. She could retreat into the safety of her invisible existence, identifying herself merely as Lady Pemberton's companion, and disappearing back into the shadows where women like her belonged, or she could step forward into the light and discover what might happen when two souls recognized each other across the vast gulf that society had placed between them. The November rain drummed against the tall windows of Pemberton Hall's magnificent library, creating a symphony that seemed to underscore the profound silence that had fallen between Grace and the gentleman who had introduced himself as Edward Ravensmoor. Grace's mind raced as she processed the implications of his name. Ravensmoor was one of the oldest and most powerful ducal families in England, which meant she was standing in the presence of a man whose social position was so far above her own that their very conversation was a breach of protocol that could cost her her employment if discovered. "Grace Thornton, Your Grace," she said finally, offering a curtsy that was perfectly executed despite her trembling hands. "I serve as companion to Lady Margaret, Lady Pemberton's aunt. I was sent to retrieve this volume for her afternoon reading." Edward studied her with those penetrating steel blue eyes, noting the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite the obvious disparity in their circumstances, the cultured accent that spoke of an education far superior to what most servants received, and the natural grace that no amount of training could instill if it wasn't already present in someone's character. "Miss Thornton," he said, deliberately using the more respectful form of address despite her servant status. "That's a Gothic novel you've selected. Are you familiar with Mrs. Radcliffe's work?" Grace felt her cheeks warm with surprise at his question. Most gentlemen of his rank would never think to discuss literature with a servant, let alone ask for her opinion on such matters. "I am, Your Grace. Lady Margaret has developed quite a fondness for tales of mystery and romance, though I confess I find Mrs. Radcliffe's heroines rather trying at times." "Trying?" Edward asked, his eyebrows rising with genuine interest. "In what way?" "They seem to faint at the slightest provocation and require constant rescue from their own poor judgment," Grace replied, then immediately regretted her boldness. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I spoke out of turn. It's not my place to criticize literature that others enjoy." "On the contrary," Edward said with a smile that transformed his austere features and made Grace's heart skip a beat. "I find your observation quite astute. I've often thought that Mrs. Radcliffe's heroines would benefit from a bit more backbone and common sense. What sort of heroine would you prefer to read about?" The question was so unexpected, so far removed from the kind of interaction Grace was accustomed to having with her social superiors, that for a moment she could only stare at him in amazement. That is, I suppose I would prefer to read about women who face their challenges with courage rather than vapors, who solve their own problems rather than waiting for rescue, and who value character over circumstance. Women like yourself, in other words, Edward said quietly, and there was something in his tone that made Grace look at him sharply, wondering if he was mocking her. But there was no mockery in his steel blue eyes, only a warmth and respect that Grace had never encountered from a gentleman of his rank. Your Grace, you don't know me well enough to make such an assessment. Perhaps not, Edward agreed. But I know that you carry yourself with dignity, despite circumstances that many would find demoralizing. I know that you speak with intelligence and education that suggests a background quite different from your current position. And I know that you have the courage to express your honest opinions, even when speaking to someone who could make your life difficult if he chose to take offense. Grace felt tears prick her eyes at his words, moved by the recognition and respect she heard in his voice. Your Grace, I should return to Lady Margaret. She'll be wondering what's become of her book. Of course, Edward said, though Grace could have sworn she heard reluctance in his voice. Perhaps, that is, I'll be staying at Pemberton Hall for several weeks. Might I hope to encounter you again during my visit? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Grace hardly dared to consider. I'm sure our paths will cross again, Your Grace, given the size of the household. I hope they will, Edward said with such sincerity that Grace felt her carefully guarded heart flutter with dangerous hope. As Grace made her way back to Lady Margaret's rooms, her mind reeled with the implications of what had just occurred. Duke Edward Ravensmoor, one of the most eligible and powerful men in England, had not only treated her with respect and courtesy, but had seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions. It was the stuff of fairy tales, the kind of impossible dream that women in her position were wise to dismiss before it could take root and cause heartbreak. But even as Grace tried to convince herself that the encounter had meant nothing, that the Duke was simply being polite to a servant who had caught his attention momentarily, she found herself replaying every word of their conversation, analyzing every glance and gesture for signs that his interest might be more than casual kindness. "There you are, dear," Lady Margaret said, as Grace entered her sitting room with the requested book. "I was beginning to think you'd gotten lost in that enormous library." "Forgive me, my lady," Grace replied, settling into her usual chair beside the elderly woman's chaise lounge. "I encountered a slight delay in locating the correct volume." Lady Margaret, who was 73 years old and possessed of the sharp eyes and sharper wit that had made her a formidable force in society during her younger years, studied Grace's face with interest. "You look rather flushed, my dear. Are you feeling quite well?" "Perfectly well, thank you," Grace replied, though she could feel heat rising in her cheeks at the memory of steel blue eyes and a smile that had made her forget for a few precious moments exactly who and what she was. Lady Margaret mused, her keen gaze missing nothing. "Well, no matter. Shall we begin today's reading? I'm quite eager to discover whether our heroine will finally show some sense and stop wandering about dark castles in her nightgown." As Grace began to read aloud from Mrs. Radcliffe's latest Gothic romance, her mind kept drifting to her encounter with the Duke and the way he had looked at her. Not as a servant to be dismissed or ignored, but as a woman worthy of attention and respect. It was dangerous to allow such thoughts to take root, she knew. Men like Edward Ravensmoor might be kind to their social inferiors, might even engage them in interesting conversation, but they married within their own sphere, choosing wives who brought wealth, connections, and the kind of polished beauty that enhanced their position in society. Grace had none of those things to offer. She was a vicar's daughter with no dowry, no family connections, and no prospects beyond a life of genteel servitude. To imagine that a duke might see her as anything more than a momentary diversion was the height of foolishness. But even as she lectured herself on the dangers of romantic fantasy, Grace found herself hoping that their paths would indeed cross again during his visit to Pemberton Hall. Perhaps it was foolish, perhaps it would only lead to heartbreak, but for the first time in years, Grace felt truly alive, awakened from the grey existence she had accepted as her fate by the possibility that someone might see her as more than just a useful pair of hands and a pleasant voice for reading aloud. The following morning brought crisp autumn sunshine that transformed the grounds of Pemberton Hall into a canvas of gold and crimson. Grace was taking her customary early walk through the gardens, one of the few pleasures she allowed herself during her brief periods of free time, when she encountered the Duke again. this time mounted on a magnificent black stallion that seemed to dance beneath him with barely contained energy. "Miss Thornton," Edward called out as he brought his horse to a halt near the path where she was walking. "Good morning. I hope you're enjoying this beautiful weather." "Good morning, Your Grace," Grace replied, offering a curtsy that was somewhat hampered by the simple walking dress and practical boots she wore for her morning exercise. "It is indeed a lovely morning. I find that early walks help clear the mind for the day's duties." Edward dismounted with fluid grace, leading his horse by the reins as he fell into step beside Grace on the garden path. "I share that sentiment entirely. There's something about the morning air that seems to wash away the complexities of the previous day and offer fresh perspective on whatever challenges lie ahead." "Your Grace," Grace said hesitantly, "I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but should you be walking with me? If someone were to see us together, they would see a gentleman taking a morning walk with an intelligent and interesting companion," Edward replied firmly. "Miss Thornton, I hope you won't allow society's arbitrary rules to prevent us from enjoying a pleasant conversation." Grace looked at him uncertainly, torn between the pleasure of his company and the practical knowledge that such interactions could have serious consequences for someone in her position. "Your Grace, you may be able to disregard society's rules, but I cannot. My livelihood depends on maintaining a reputation for propriety and knowing my place. And what if I were to suggest that your place might be higher than you've been led to believe?" Edward asked quietly, his steel blue eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I would say that you're being kind, but that kindness can be dangerous for someone in my circumstances," Grace replied with painful honesty. "Your Grace, I'm grateful for your courtesy, but I cannot afford to mistake it for something more significant than it is." Edward stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression serious as he studied her face. "Miss Thornton, what if I told you that my interest in your company has nothing to do with kindness and everything to do with the fact that you're the first woman I've met in years who speaks to me as though I'm a man rather than a title? I would say that you're a duke and I'm a servant, and that such distinctions matter whether we wish they did or not," Grace replied, though her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "They matter to society," Edward agreed. "But do they matter to you? When you look at me, do you see only a duke? Or do you see a man who finds your conversation more engaging than anything he's experienced in London's most fashionable drawing rooms?" Grace stared at him, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. "Your Grace, what are you asking of me?" "I'm asking you to consider the possibility that worth isn't determined by birth or fortune, but by character and intelligence, and the ability to see beauty in unexpected places," Edward said, his voice low and intense. "I'm asking you to believe that a duke might fall in love with a vicar's daughter, not despite her humble circumstances, but because of the strength and grace she's developed through facing those circumstances with dignity." "Love," Grace whispered, the word hanging in the crisp morning air like a promise too wonderful to be real. "Love," Edward confirmed, stepping closer to her with eyes that blazed with emotion. "Grace, I know this seems impossible. I know the obstacles we would face, but I also know that I've never felt for any woman what I feel for you after just 2 conversations." Grace felt tears streaming down her face as she struggled to process the magnitude of what he was saying. "Edward, this is madness. You could have any woman in England. Wealthy, beautiful, connected women who could enhance your position and bring honor to your family name. Why would you choose someone like me? Because you're the only woman who's ever made me forget that I'm a duke," Edward replied simply. "Because when I'm with you, I remember what it feels like to be simply a man talking to a woman he admires. Because you have something that all the wealthy, beautiful, connected women lack: authenticity, genuine warmth, and a strength of character that humbles me. But the scandal will pass," Edward said firmly. "Grace, I've spent my entire adult life doing what was expected of me, following rules that often made no sense, sacrificing my personal happiness for the sake of duty and propriety. I won't do it anymore. I won't let society's prejudices keep me from the woman I love." Grace looked into his steel blue eyes and saw not just love, but absolute conviction, a determination so strong that it began to chip away at the walls of doubt and resignation she had built around her heart over the years. "Edward," she said softly, using his given name for the first time, "if we pursue this path, there will be no going back. Once society learns of our attachment, we'll both be committed to facing whatever consequences follow. Then we'll face them together," Edward said, reaching out to take her hands in his with gentle strength. Grace, I would rather spend my life as a social outcast with you by my side than live in the highest circles of society without you. As Grace looked into his eyes and saw the depth of his love and the strength of his commitment, she felt the last of her resistance crumble. Perhaps it was madness. Perhaps it would end in heartbreak. But for the first time in her life, Grace chose hope over fear, love over security, and the possibility of extraordinary happiness over the certainty of a safe but empty existence. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Yes?" Edward repeated, his face lighting with joy and wonder. "Yes, I love you too," Grace said more firmly, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Yes, I'll trust in your love and my own heart, rather than in society's narrow definitions of what's possible. Yes, I'll face whatever challenges await us, as long as we face them together." Edward's response was to pull her into his arms and kiss her with a passion that spoke to months of restrained longing, a kiss that promised a future filled with love, challenge, and the kind of happiness that came from choosing each other against all odds. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had just committed to, Edward rested his forehead against hers and smiled. "We're going to face opposition," he said quietly. "There will be those who try to convince us that we're making a mistake, that love isn't enough to overcome the obstacles in our path. Then we'll prove them wrong," Grace replied, with a confidence that surprised her. "We'll show them that true love, when it's built on mutual respect and genuine affection, can indeed conquer all." As they walked back toward the house together, Grace marveled at the transformation in her circumstances. Yesterday she had been a servant, resigned to a life of invisibility and quiet service. Today she was beloved by a duke who saw her not as a burden or an oddity, but as a treasure worth any sacrifice society might demand. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be scandal, opposition, and challenges that would test their love and their resolve. But for the first time in her adult life, Grace felt truly alive, awakened from her grey existence by the love of a man who valued character over circumstance and had chosen her heart over society's expectations. The Duke had indeed fallen in love with a humble lady without a dowry, and in doing so, he had proven that the most beautiful love stories were not those that followed society's rules, but those that had the courage to write their own. The revelation. The days that followed Grace and Edward's declaration in the garden passed in a haze of stolen moments and secret glances, as they navigated the delicate balance between their growing love and the necessity of maintaining discretion within the confines of Pemberton Hall. Grace found herself living in two worlds simultaneously, the public world where she remained Lady Margaret's quiet companion, invisible to most of the household, and the private world where she was beloved by a duke who saw her as the most precious thing in his life. Their meetings were necessarily brief and carefully orchestrated to avoid suspicion. A few minutes of conversation in the library while Grace retrieved books for Lady Margaret, a chance encounter during her morning walks, when Edward happened to be returning from his rides, stolen moments in the conservatory where Grace sometimes went to tend to Lady Margaret's correspondence, while Edward claimed to be examining the exotic plants that Lord Pemberton had collected from his travels. Each interaction deepened their connection and strengthened their resolve, but also heightened their awareness of the precarious nature of their situation. Grace was acutely conscious that her position at Pemberton Hall depended entirely on Lady Margaret's goodwill, and that any hint of impropriety could result in her immediate dismissal without references, a fate that would make it nearly impossible for her to find other employment. It was during one of these clandestine meetings, a week after their first kiss, that their carefully maintained secret was discovered in the most unfortunate way possible. Grace was in the conservatory, ostensibly watering Lady Margaret's prized orchids, but actually waiting for Edward, who had promised to meet her there after his morning correspondence was complete. She was so absorbed in watching for his arrival that she failed to notice the approach of another figure until a sharp voice cut through the humid air like a blade. "Well, well, what have we here?" Grace spun around to find herself face to face with Lady Pemberton herself, the formidable mistress of the house whose sharp eyes and sharper tongue had made her one of society's most feared arbiters of propriety. At 55, Lady Pemberton was still a handsome woman, with silver hair arranged in a severe style and pale blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing as they took in Grace's flushed cheeks and guilty expression. "My lady," Grace said, offering a curtsy that she hoped would disguise her nervousness. "I was attending to Lady Margaret's orchids, as she requested." "Were you indeed?" Lady Pemberton replied with obvious skepticism. "How curious, then, that you should be here at precisely the same time that the Duke of Ravensmoor has taken to visiting the conservatory each morning. Quite a coincidence, wouldn't you say?" Grace felt her heart sink as she realized that their secret meetings had not been as secret as they had believed. "My lady, I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" Lady Pemberton said, moving closer with the predatory grace of a cat stalking its prey. "Miss Thornton, I've been watching you for several days now, and I've noticed some very interesting patterns in your behavior. You seem to have developed a remarkable interest in early morning walks, afternoon visits to the library, and now tending to plants that my aunt has never shown the slightest concern for before." Before Grace could formulate a response to these damning observations, the conservatory door opened and Edward himself entered, his face lighting with pleasure at the sight of Grace before darkening with concern as he noticed Lady Pemberton's presence. "Lady Pemberton," he said, offering a bow that was perfectly correct, but somehow managed to convey his displeasure at the interruption. "I didn't expect to find you here." "Nor I you, Your Grace," Lady Pemberton replied with a smile that held no warmth. "Though I confess I'm beginning to understand the attraction this particular room holds for you." Edward's steel-blue eyes hardened as he recognized the threat in her tone. "I'm afraid I don't follow your meaning, don't you?" Lady Pemberton said, echoing her earlier words to Grace. "Your Grace, I may be many things, but I am not blind. I've observed the way you look at Miss Thornton, the way you seek out her company, the way you both seem to find excuses to be in the same places at the same times. What I want to know is what you intend to do about this situation." The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Grace felt her stomach clench with dread as she waited for Edward's response. This was the moment when he would be forced to choose between his reputation and his feelings, when the reality of their different stations would assert itself and destroy the beautiful dream they had been living. But Edward surprised them both by stepping forward to place himself protectively between Grace and Lady Pemberton, his bearing radiating the full authority of his ducal position. "What I intend to do," he said with quiet dignity, "is marry Miss Thornton, with or without society's approval." The words fell into the humid air of the conservatory like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of shock that seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of the house. Lady Pemberton's face went white, then red, then white again, as she struggled to process what she had just heard. "Marry her," she repeated, her voice rising with incredulity. "Your Grace, surely you cannot be serious. Miss Thornton is a servant, a woman with no dowry, no family, no connections of any kind. The scandal would be enormous." "The scandal will be temporary," Edward replied firmly. "My love for Miss Thornton is permanent." "Your Grace," Grace said quietly, her voice trembling with emotion, "perhaps we should discuss this privately." "No," Edward said, turning to face her with eyes that blazed with conviction. "Grace, I'm tired of hiding our feelings, tired of pretending that what we have is something to be ashamed of. I love you, and I want the world to know it." "But the consequences," Grace began. "Will be whatever they are," Edward interrupted gently. "Grace, I would rather face any consequence with you by my side than live without you to avoid scandal." Lady Pemberton had been listening to this exchange with growing horror, and now she stepped forward with the authority of a woman accustomed to being obeyed. "Your Grace, I cannot allow this madness to continue under my roof," she declared. "Miss Thornton, you will pack your belongings immediately and leave Pemberton Hall. I will not have my household associated with such impropriety." "Lady Pemberton," Edward said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made other nobles step aside, "I would advise you to reconsider that decision." "And why should I do that?" Lady Pemberton demanded. "Because Miss Thornton is under my protection now," Edward replied with steel in his voice. "Any discourtesy shown to her will be considered a personal insult to me, and I assure you that my memory for such slights is very long indeed." The threat was unmistakable, delivered with the kind of quiet menace that reminded everyone present that Edward was not just a duke, but one of the most powerful men in England, with the ability to make life very difficult for those who crossed him. Lady Pemberton's face went pale as she recognized the implications of his words. "Your Grace, surely you cannot mean to ruin your reputation for a mere servant." "I mean to marry the woman I love," Edward said firmly, "and I suggest you adjust your attitude toward my future Duchess accordingly." "Future Duchess?" Lady Pemberton repeated faintly, as though the words were too shocking to comprehend. Future Duchess, Edward confirmed, turning to Grace with a smile that made her heart race. That is, if Miss Thornton will do me the honor of accepting my proposal. Grace stared at him in amazement, hardly able to believe that he was proposing to her in front of Lady Pemberton, making their engagement a public declaration that could never be taken back or hidden. Edward, are you certain? Once you speak these words, there will be no retreat, no way to undo what we've set in motion. I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Edward replied, taking her hands in his with gentle strength. Grace Thornton, will you marry me? Grace looked into his steel blue eyes and saw not just love, but absolute conviction, a determination so strong that it swept away her last remaining doubts about the wisdom of their union. Yes, she said, her voice clear and strong despite the tears streaming down her face. Yes, Edward, I will marry you. Edward's response was to pull her into his arms and kiss her with a passion that left no doubt about the depth of his feelings, while Lady Pemberton watched in stunned silence, apparently unable to process the magnitude of what she was witnessing. When they finally broke apart, Edward turned to face Lady Pemberton with the full authority of his position. Lady Pemberton, I trust that Miss Thornton will be treated with the respect due to my future wife for the remainder of our stay at Pemberton Hall. Any failure to do so will be met with consequences that I assure you will be most unpleasant. Of course, Your Grace, Lady Pemberton managed to say, though her voice was barely above a whisper. I offer my congratulations on your engagement. Thank you, Edward replied with cool politeness. I'm certain you'll want to share the news with your other guests. I trust you'll present it in the most favorable light possible. After Lady Pemberton departed, clearly eager to escape the conservatory and process what she had witnessed, Grace and Edward found themselves alone with the magnitude of what they had just committed to. Edward, Grace said quietly, do you realize what you've just done? By tomorrow, news of our engagement will be all over the county. Within a week, it will be the talk of London. Good, Edward replied with satisfaction. Let them talk. Let them gossip and speculate and express their shock. Grace, I'm tired of hiding my feelings for you. I want the world to know that I've found the woman I want to spend my life with. But the scandal will pass, Edward said firmly, echoing his earlier words. Grace, scandals are temporary. Love like ours is forever. And your family, your friends, your position in society will adapt or be left behind, Edward said with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his own worth. Grace, I have enough wealth to ensure our security, enough influence to protect us from the worst of society's cruelty, and enough love to make up for any hardships we might face. Grace looked into his eyes and saw the absolute certainty there, the unwavering conviction that their love could overcome any obstacle. For the first time since their relationship had begun, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps it really was possible, that a duke could marry a vicar's daughter and find happiness despite society's disapproval. What happens now? She asked softly. Now we plan a wedding, Edward said with a smile that made her heart soar. Now we face whatever challenges await us together. Now we prove to the world that true love is stronger than social convention. As they stood together in the conservatory, surrounded by exotic flowers and the promise of a future that would challenge every rule society held sacred, Grace felt a peace settle over her that she had never experienced before. She was going to marry the man she loved, become a duchess, and prove that worth was indeed measured by character rather than circumstance. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be opposition, scandal, and challenges that would test their love and their resolve. But for the first time in her life, Grace felt ready to face whatever the future might bring, secure in the knowledge that she would face it with the love and support of a man who valued her heart over society's expectations. The Duke had indeed fallen in love with a humble lady without a dowry, and in choosing to marry her despite the obstacles they would face, he had proven that the most beautiful love stories were those that had the courage to defy convention in pursuit of genuine happiness. The storm breaks news of the Duke of Ravenshire's engagement to his hostess's companion spread through the countryside with the speed of wildfire, reaching London within 3 days and setting the town ablaze with speculation, outrage, and fascination. Grace found herself thrust from complete obscurity into the harsh glare of public scrutiny as society struggled to comprehend how one of England's most eligible dukes could have chosen to marry a woman without fortune, family, or any of the qualifications they deemed essential for a duchess. The transformation in how Grace was treated at Pemberton Hall was immediate and telling. Servants who had barely acknowledged her existence now bowed and curtsied when they encountered her in the corridors. Lady Pemberton, clearly terrified of offending Edward, had moved Grace from her small servants' room to an elegant guest suite and assigned her a lady's maid, though her manner remained stiff and uncomfortable whenever they interacted. But it was Lady Margaret who provided the most honest assessment of the situation during one of their afternoon reading sessions, which had resumed despite Grace's changed circumstances. "My dear," the elderly woman said, setting aside the Gothic novel they had been reading and fixing Grace with her sharp, intelligent eyes, "I hope you understand what you've undertaken. The Duke's declaration has made you one of the most talked-about women in England, and not all of that talk will be kind." "I'm beginning to realize that, my lady," Grace replied quietly. She had already received several letters from London acquaintances of Lady Margaret's, ostensibly offering congratulations, but actually fishing for details about the scandalous engagement. "The question is whether you're strong enough to weather the storm that's coming," Lady Margaret continued. "Grace, I've grown fond of you during our time together, and I want you to succeed, but I also want you to understand that being a duchess involves far more than loving a duke." "What do you mean?" Grace asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I mean that you'll be expected to manage vast households, entertain foreign dignitaries, navigate the treacherous waters of court politics, and serve as a leader in society, all while being scrutinized by people who are looking for any excuse to declare you unfit for your position," Lady Margaret explained with brutal honesty. "And you don't think I'm capable of learning such things?" "On the contrary, I think you're more than capable," Lady Margaret said with a smile that transformed her austere features. "You have intelligence, Grace, and a strength of character that many born to the position lack. But capability and preparation are two different things, my dear." "What are you suggesting?" "That we use the time remaining before your wedding to prepare you for the role you're about to assume," Lady Margaret said decisively. "Grace, I may be old and retired from society, but I was once considered one of the most accomplished hostesses in London. If you're willing to learn, I'm willing to teach you everything you'll need to know about being a duchess." Grace felt tears of gratitude spring to her eyes at this unexpected offer of support. "Lady Margaret, why would you do such a thing for me?" "Because I believe in love, my dear," the elderly woman replied simply. "And because I think you and the Duke have the potential to show society that marriages based on genuine affection are stronger than those built on mere convenience." Over the following weeks, Grace threw herself into an intensive education in the duties and expectations of a duchess. Lady Margaret proved to be a demanding but patient teacher, drilling Grace in everything from the proper precedence for seating arrangements at formal dinners to the subtle art of managing household staff and the complex etiquette of court presentations. "Remember," Lady Margaret said during one of their lessons on entertaining, "a duchess must be able to make a foreign ambassador feel welcome while simultaneously ensuring that a nervous debutante feels comfortable and that a rival hostess doesn't upstage her own event. It requires the diplomatic skills of a minister and the strategic thinking of a general." "It sounds terrifying," Grace admitted. "It can be," Lady Margaret agreed, "but it can also be immensely rewarding when done well. Grace, you have the intelligence and the character to excel at this role. What you need now is confidence in your own abilities." Meanwhile, Edward was dealing with his own challenges as news of their engagement reached his family and friends in London. The first response came from his mother, the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmoor, in the form of a letter that arrived with unusual speed and bore the unmistakable signs of having been written in a state of extreme agitation. "Edward, I have just received the most disturbing news regarding your supposed engagement to a woman of no family or fortune. I can only assume that this is some sort of jest or that you have taken leave of your senses entirely. I am departing for Pemberton Hall immediately to discuss this matter with you in person. I trust that by the time I arrive, you will have come to your senses and ended this inappropriate association. Your mother, Catherine, Duchess of Ravensmoor." Edward read the letter twice, his expression growing grimmer with each reading. He had expected opposition from his family, but the dismissive tone of his mother's response and her assumption that his feelings for Grace were either temporary madness or an elaborate joke stung more than he had anticipated. "Bad news?" Grace asked, noting his expression as he joined her for their afternoon walk in the gardens. "My mother is coming to discuss our engagement," Edward said, handing her the letter. "I suspect her idea of discussion will involve a great deal of lecturing about duty and propriety." Grace read the letter with growing dismay, noting the Dowager Duchess's complete dismissal of her worth and the assumption that Edward's feelings were somehow aberrant. "Edward, perhaps I should leave before she arrives. It might be easier for you to explain our relationship without my presence complicating matters." "Absolutely not," Edward said firmly. "Grace, you're going to be my wife, which means you're going to be my mother's daughter-in-law whether she likes it or not. She needs to meet you and understand that my choice is final. But what if she refuses to accept me? What if your entire family turns against you because of our marriage? Then they'll be the ones who lose," Edward replied with quiet conviction. "Grace, I love my family, but I won't sacrifice our happiness for their approval. If they can't see your worth, then that's their failing, not ours." The Dowager Duchess arrived 2 days later in a travelling coach that seemed to announce her displeasure with every creak and rattle. At 63, Catherine Ravensmoor was still a formidable woman, with silver hair arranged in an intimidating style and pale grey eyes that seemed to miss nothing as they surveyed Pemberton Hall with obvious disapproval. Her bearing radiated the kind of aristocratic authority that had made her one of society's most influential figures for over 4 decades. Grace watched from her bedroom window as the Dowager Duchess's entourage arrived, her stomach clenching with anxiety as she contemplated the confrontation that was about to unfold. She had dressed carefully for the occasion in a gown of deep blue silk that Lady Margaret had insisted she borrow, wanting to make the best possible impression on the woman who would either become her ally or her most formidable enemy. "Remember what I've taught you," Lady Margaret said as she helped Grace arrange her soft brown hair in a more sophisticated style. "Stand straight, speak clearly, and never apologize for who you are. You have every right to be here, every right to love the Duke, and every right to expect respectful treatment from his family." "What if she hates me on sight?" Grace asked, her voice betraying her nervousness. "Then she'll be revealing her own character, not yours," Lady Margaret replied firmly. "Grace, you are a woman of intelligence, integrity, and genuine warmth. If the Dowager Duchess cannot see those qualities, then the fault lies with her judgment, not with your worth." The confrontation took place in Pemberton Hall's formal drawing room, with Lady Pemberton hovering nervously in the background and Edward standing protectively beside Grace as his mother entered with all the ceremony of a queen holding court. The Dowager Duchess was dressed in travelling clothes of the finest quality, her every accessory chosen to emphasize her elevated status and the vast gulf between her position and that of the woman her son had chosen to marry. "Edward," she said, offering her cheek for his dutiful kiss, while her eyes remained fixed on Grace with an expression that could have frozen fire. "I trust you've had time to reconsider this situation since my letter arrived." "Mother," Edward replied with careful courtesy, "may I present Miss Grace Thornton, my fiancée? Grace, this is my mother, the Dowager Duchess of Ravensmoor." Grace rose from her chair and executed a perfect curtsy, drawing on every lesson Lady Margaret had drilled into her about proper protocol. "Your Grace, I'm honored to meet you." The Dowager Duchess studied Grace with the thoroughness of a scientist, examining a particularly interesting specimen, her pale grey eyes taking in every detail of her appearance, deportment, and manner. "Miss Thornton, I confess myself curious about your background. Edward's letter was remarkably vague about your family and circumstances." "My father was the Reverend James Thornton, Your Grace," Grace replied with quiet dignity. "He served as vicar of St. Mary's in Little Wickham until his death 8 years ago. I have no other family of significance." "A vicar's daughter," the Dowager Duchess repeated, her tone making the words sound like an accusation. "And your dowry? Your family's connections?" "I have no dowry, Your Grace, and no connections beyond those I've formed through my own efforts," Grace said honestly, refusing to be ashamed of circumstances beyond her control. "I see." The Dowager Duchess turned to her son with an expression of barely controlled fury. "Edward, surely you can see the impossibility of this situation. You are the Duke of Ravensmoor, heir to one of England's oldest and most respected titles. You cannot marry a woman with no fortune, no family, no qualifications whatsoever for the position of Duchess. "On the contrary, mother," Edward replied with steel in his voice, "Miss Thornton possesses all the qualifications that matter: intelligence, integrity, compassion, and the strength of character that will make her an excellent Duchess." "Character?" the Dowager Duchess scoffed. "Edward, you speak as though character alone could manage a ducal household, entertain foreign dignitaries, or navigate the complexities of court politics. This woman has spent her life as a servant. What could she possibly know about the duties and responsibilities that come with our position?" "More than you might think, Your Grace," Grace said quietly, drawing on the confidence that Lady Margaret's training had instilled in her. "While it's true that I lack experience with the specific duties of a duchess, I've spent years managing households, organizing social events, and dealing with people from all walks of life. I may not have been born to the position, but I'm willing to learn whatever is necessary to fulfill it properly." "Willing to learn?" the Dowager Duchess repeated with obvious disdain. "Miss Thornton, being a duchess is not a skill that can be acquired through willingness alone. It requires breeding, education, and an understanding of society that comes from a lifetime of preparation." "Then perhaps," Lady Margaret interjected from her position near the fireplace, where she had been observing the confrontation with growing indignation, "you should know that Miss Thornton has been receiving intensive instruction in those very subjects from someone who was considered one of London's most accomplished hostesses during her active years in society." The Dowager Duchess turned to Lady Margaret with surprise, clearly not having expected intervention from that quarter. "Lady Margaret, surely you cannot approve of this misalliance." "On the contrary," Lady Margaret replied with the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing to fear. "I approve of it wholeheartedly. Catherine, I've known your son since he was a boy, and I've never seen him as happy as he's been these past weeks. Miss Thornton has brought out the best in him, his kindness, his intelligence, his capacity for genuine affection. Isn't that worth more than all the dowries and connections in England?" "It's worth nothing if it destroys his reputation and diminishes his ability to serve his country effectively," the Dowager Duchess replied sharply. "Lady Margaret, you may be willing to indulge romantic fantasies, but I have a responsibility to protect my family's interests." "And what about your responsibility to your son's happiness?" Edward asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Mother, I've spent my entire adult life fulfilling my duties, meeting my obligations, and sacrificing my personal desires for the sake of family honor. Don't I deserve the chance to marry for love rather than convenience?" "Love is a luxury that men in your position cannot afford," the Dowager Duchess replied coldly. "Edward, you have responsibilities that transcend your personal feelings. Your marriage will affect not just you, but generations of Ravenshires to come." "Then perhaps it's time for the Ravenshire family to set a new precedent," Edward said firmly. "Perhaps it's time to show that our nobility comes from our character rather than our adherence to outdated social conventions." The argument continued for over an hour, with the Dowager Duchess marshalling every weapon in her considerable arsenal: family duty, social obligation, political necessity, concern for the family's reputation. But Edward remained unmoved, his resolve only strengthening with each attempt to dissuade him from his chosen course. Grace listened to the debate with growing pain, hearing herself described as a burden, a liability, a woman whose very existence threatened the stability of one of England's great families. But she also heard Edward's unwavering defense of their love, his absolute refusal to be swayed by arguments that reduced their relationship to a matter of social convenience. Finally, when it became clear that Edward would not be moved by persuasion, the Dowager Duchess played her final card. "Very well," she said, her voice cold with finality. "If you insist on proceeding with this marriage, Edward, then you do so without my blessing or support. I will not attend the wedding, I will not receive this woman as my daughter-in-law, and I will make it clear to all of society that the family does not approve of your choice." The threat hung in the air like a sword, and Grace felt her heart break at the thought that her love for Edward was costing him his relationship with his mother. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "perhaps if I were to—" "No," Edward interrupted firmly, his steel blue eyes blazing with determination. "Grace, you will not sacrifice yourself to appease prejudice and narrow-mindedness. Mother, if you choose to cut yourself off from my happiness, then that's your decision. But I will not abandon the woman I love to preserve a relationship with someone who cannot see her worth." The Dowager Duchess stared at her son in shock, clearly not having expected such absolute defiance. "Edward, you cannot mean—" "I mean every word," Edward replied with quiet finality. Mother, I love you, but I love Grace more. If you cannot accept that, then we have nothing further to discuss. After the Dowager Duchess departed in a fury of wounded pride and aristocratic indignation, Grace and Edward found themselves alone in the drawing room, both emotionally drained by the confrontation and its implications. Edward, Grace said softly, tears streaming down her face, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to come between you and your family. You haven't come between us, Edward replied, pulling her into his arms with gentle strength. My mother's prejudices have done that. Grace, I meant what I said. I would rather have you and lose everything else than have everything else and lose you. But your family, your position in society, will survive or adapt, Edward said firmly. Grace, my mother's opposition is painful, but it's not unexpected. She spent her entire life believing that worth is determined by birth and fortune. It will take time for her to understand that you possess qualities far more valuable than any dowry. And if she never comes to understand that, then that will be her loss, not ours, Edward said with conviction. Grace, I've made my choice, and I'm at peace with it. Are you? Grace looked into his steel blue eyes and saw not just love, but absolute certainty. A determination so strong that it began to heal the wounds that the Dowager Duchess's words had inflicted. Yes, she said finally. Yes, I am. Edward, if you're willing to face whatever consequences come from our marriage, then so am I. The weeks that followed brought a steady stream of visitors to Pemberton Hall. As news of the engagement continued to spread, and various members of society felt compelled to see for themselves the woman who had captured a duke's heart. Some came out of genuine curiosity, others from a desire to witness what they expected to be a spectacular social disaster, and still others from a sincere wish to offer their support to a couple who had dared to marry for love. Among the most significant visitors was Edward's younger sister, Lady Caroline Ashford, who arrived unannounced one afternoon with an expression of barely contained excitement and curiosity. Edward, she exclaimed as she burst into the drawing room where Grace and Edward were taking tea. I simply had to come and meet the woman who has managed to make my impossibly proper brother forget every rule of social conduct. At 28, Caroline was a striking woman with dark hair and the same steel blue eyes as her brother. But where Edward's bearing spoke of duty and responsibility, Caroline radiated warmth and mischief that made her immediately likable. Caroline, Edward said, rising to embrace his sister with obvious affection, I wasn't expecting you. Of course you weren't, Caroline replied with a grin. If I had announced my visit, Mother would have tried to prevent me from coming. She's convinced that meeting your mysterious fiancé will somehow contaminate me with revolutionary ideas about marrying for love. And you don't share her concerns? Edward asked. On the contrary, I'm delighted that you've finally found someone who makes you happy, Caroline said warmly, then turned to Grace with genuine interest. Miss Thornton, I presume. I'm Caroline, Edward's sister and greatest admirer. I've been dying to meet the woman who has managed to make my brother smile more in the past month than he has in the past year. Grace rose and offered a curtsy, but Caroline waved away the formality and embraced her instead. None of that, please. We're going to be sisters, which means we must be friends. Now tell me everything. How did you meet? How did Edward propose? And most importantly, how are you managing to remain sane while dealing with all the gossip and speculation? Over the following hours, Caroline proved to be exactly the ally that Grace had hoped for, but hadn't dared to expect. Unlike her mother, Caroline was genuinely interested in Grace as a person rather than as a threat to family honor, asking thoughtful questions about her background, her interests, and her hopes for the future. You know, Caroline said, as they walked together in the gardens while Edward attended to correspondence, I think you're exactly what Edward needs. He spent so many years being the perfect duke that I was beginning to worry he'd forgotten how to be simply a man. You've reminded him of that, and I'm grateful. Your mother doesn't share that sentiment, Grace observed quietly. My mother is terrified of change, Caroline replied with a sigh. She spent her entire life believing that our family's worth comes from our adherence to tradition and social convention. The idea that Edward might find happiness with someone outside that narrow world threatens everything she thinks she knows about how the world should work. Do you think she'll ever accept me? I think she'll have no choice, Caroline said with conviction. Grace, once you're married to Edward, you'll be the Duchess of Ravensmoor whether Mother likes it or not. She can either accept that reality and try to build a relationship with you, or she can remain isolated and bitter. I know which choice I hope she'll make. And what about the rest of society? Will they ever accept a duchess without a dowry? Caroline was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. Some will, some won't. But Grace, I think you underestimate your own power to change minds. You have intelligence, grace, and genuine warmth, qualities that many born to the position lack. Once people meet you, once they see how well suited you and Edward are, I think you'll find more acceptance than you expect. And those who refuse to accept me will reveal themselves to be exactly the kind of small-minded individuals whose opinions don't matter anyway, Caroline said firmly. Grace, true society, the people worth knowing, will judge you by your character, not your bank account. Caroline's visit proved to be a turning point in Grace's confidence and preparation for her new role. With Lady Margaret providing instruction in the practical aspects of being a duchess and Caroline offering emotional support and encouragement, Grace began to feel that she might indeed be capable of rising to the challenges that awaited her. The wedding preparations themselves became a delicate balance between Edward's desire to celebrate their love openly and the practical necessity of managing the social and political implications of their union. They decided to hold the ceremony at Edward's estate, Ravensmoor Park, both to avoid the circus that a London wedding would create and to establish Grace's position as mistress of the family seat from the very beginning. The guest list is proving interesting, Edward told Grace one evening as they reviewed the responses to their invitations. About half of those invited have accepted enthusiastically, a quarter have declined with various excuses, and the remainder are clearly waiting to see which way the social winds blow before committing themselves. And your family? Grace asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Caroline will be there, of course, along with several of my cousins who have expressed their support. My mother remains unmoved by my attempts at reconciliation. Grace felt a familiar pang of guilt at the thought that her marriage to Edward was costing him his relationship with his mother. Edward, perhaps if I were to write to her to try to explain— Grace, Edward interrupted gently, my mother's opposition has nothing to do with you personally, and everything to do with her own fears and prejudices. No letter from you will change her mind. Only time and the evidence of our successful marriage will do that. And if time doesn't change her mind, then we'll build our own family traditions, Edward said with quiet determination. Grace, I refuse to let my mother's stubbornness cast a shadow over our happiness. We're creating something new and beautiful together, and I won't allow anyone, even family, to diminish that. As their wedding day approached, Grace found herself marveling at the journey that had brought her from obscurity to the verge of becoming one of England's most prominent duchesses. The frightened, resigned woman who had entered Pemberton Hall as a servant had been transformed into someone who felt capable of taking on the challenges and responsibilities that awaited her. The transformation had not been easy. There had been moments of doubt, periods of overwhelming anxiety about her ability to fulfill her new role, and painful confrontations with those who questioned her worthiness. But through it all, Edward's unwavering love and support had given her the strength to persevere, while the friendship and guidance of Lady Margaret and Caroline had provided the practical tools she needed to succeed. Are you ready for this? Lady Margaret asked on the eve of the wedding, as Grace sat in her room at Ravensmoor Park, surrounded by the elegant gowns and accessories that would mark her transformation from Miss Grace Thornton to the Duchess of Ravensmoor. I think so, Grace replied, though her voice betrayed her nervousness. Lady Margaret, what if I fail? What if I prove unequal to the demands of being a duchess? Then you'll learn from your mistakes and try again, Lady Margaret said, with the same practical wisdom that had guided Grace through her preparation. Grace, no one expects you to be perfect from the beginning. What matters is that you approach your new role with intelligence, integrity, and a genuine desire to serve others, qualities you possess in abundance. And if society never fully accepts me, then you'll create your own circle of friends and allies among those who value character over circumstance, Lady Margaret replied firmly. Grace, you're not marrying Edward to win society's approval. You're marrying him because you love each other. Everything else is secondary to that fundamental truth. As Grace prepared for bed on her last night as a single woman, she reflected on the extraordinary series of events that had brought her to this moment. A chance encounter in a library, a conversation about Gothic novels, and a duke who had seen past her humble circumstances to the woman within. It was the stuff of fairy tales, yet it was about to become her reality. Tomorrow she would marry the man she loved and begin a new chapter of her life as the Duchess of Ravensmoor. There would be challenges ahead, opposition to face, and prejudices to overcome. But for the first time in her adult life, Grace felt truly confident in her ability to meet whatever the future might bring. She had found love where she least expected it, had been chosen by a man who valued her heart over society's expectations, and had discovered strengths within herself that she had never known existed. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with Edward by her side, and that knowledge gave her the courage to embrace her destiny with joy rather than fear. The Duke had indeed fallen in love with a humble lady without a dowry, and in choosing to marry her despite all obstacles, he had proven that the most beautiful love stories were those that had the courage to defy convention in pursuit of genuine happiness. Tomorrow their fairy tale would become reality, and Grace would begin her reign as a duchess who had earned her position not through birth or fortune, but through the simple yet revolutionary act of being loved for exactly who she was. The wedding and beyond. The morning of Grace's wedding dawned clear and bright, with autumn sunlight streaming through the windows of Ravensmoor Park and casting golden light across the magnificent estate that would soon be her home. Grace woke with a mixture of excitement and nervousness that made her stomach flutter, but underneath the anxiety was a deep sense of rightness, a certainty that she was about to embark on the greatest adventure of her life. Lady Margaret and Caroline had arrived early to help with the final preparations, and the three women worked together in Grace's chambers to transform her from a vicar's daughter into a duchess worthy of the ancient title she was about to assume. "The gown is perfect," Caroline declared, as Grace's lady's maid fastened the last of the tiny pearl buttons that adorned the back of her wedding dress. The gown itself was a masterpiece of ivory silk and Brussels lace, designed to emphasize Grace's natural beauty while reflecting the dignity of her new position. "Edward chose the fabric himself," Grace said softly, smoothing the elegant skirt with trembling hands. "He said he wanted me to feel like a queen on our wedding day." "You look like one," Lady Margaret said with satisfaction as she arranged Grace's soft brown hair in an elaborate style adorned with pearls and orange blossoms. "Grace, you've grown into this role beautifully. I'm proud of the woman you've become." "I couldn't have done it without your guidance," Grace replied, tears threatening to spill over as she thought about how much her life had changed since that first meeting with Edward in the library. "Nonsense," Lady Margaret said briskly. "You had everything you needed within yourself. Intelligence, grace, and strength of character. I simply helped you recognize those qualities and learn to use them effectively." The ceremony took place in the chapel at Ravensmoor Park, a beautiful medieval structure that had witnessed centuries of family celebrations and sorrows. Despite the social controversy surrounding their union, the chapel was filled with guests who had chosen to celebrate love over convention, including several prominent members of the nobility who had decided that Edward's happiness was more important than society's arbitrary rules. As Grace made her way down the aisle on the arm of Lord Pemberton, who had graciously agreed to give her away in the absence of her own family, she felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. This was right. She knew with absolute certainty. This was where she belonged, where she had always been meant to be. Edward waited for her at the altar, resplendent in his formal wedding attire, his steel blue eyes fixed on her face with an expression of such love and pride that it took her breath away. When she reached his side, and he took her hand in his, Grace felt as though she were exactly where she belonged, where she had always been destined to be. "Dearly beloved," the Archbishop began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed chapel, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Edward Charles Ravensmoor, Duke of Ravensmoor, and Miss Grace Elizabeth Thornton in holy matrimony." As they exchanged vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other through whatever challenges lay ahead, Grace felt a joy so profound that it seemed to radiate from her very being. This was more than a wedding. It was a declaration that love could indeed conquer all obstacles, that two people who truly saw and valued each other could create something beautiful regardless of what society might think. "You may kiss the bride," the Archbishop announced, and when Edward leaned down to press his lips to hers, Grace felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. "I love you, Your Grace," Edward whispered against her lips, using her new title with a warmth that made her laugh through her tears. "And I love you, Your Grace," Grace replied, marveling at the fact that she was now the Duchess of Ravensmoor, that the impossible dream had somehow become reality. The reception that followed was a triumph of love over prejudice, as guest after guest approached the couple to offer their congratulations and express their admiration for the courage they had shown in following their hearts despite society's disapproval. "You've done something remarkable today," the Duke of Wellington told Edward, as they stood together watching Grace hold court, surrounded by well-wishers and admirers. "You've shown that true nobility comes from character, not circumstance. That's a lesson this society desperately needed to learn." "Grace taught me that lesson," Edward replied, his eyes never leaving his wife's face. "She's shown me what real worth looks like, what genuine nobility means." As the evening drew to a close and the last guests departed, Grace and Edward found themselves alone in the grand ballroom of Ravensmoor Park, surrounded by the remnants of their wedding celebration. Grace looked around at the flowers, the empty champagne glasses, the evidence of a day that had exceeded her wildest dreams, and felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the man who had made it all possible. "No regrets?" Edward asked softly, echoing the question that had become something of a ritual between them. "Only one," Grace replied with a smile that was both mischievous and tender. "What's that?" Edward asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't truly worried. "That it took so long for us to find each other," Grace said, her voice filled with wonder at the journey that had brought them together. "Edward, a year ago I thought my life would always be small and quiet, that I would never be more than a servant in other people's houses. I never dreamed that someone like you could love someone like me." "Someone like me?" Edward asked, raising an eyebrow. "Grace, you speak as though I'm somehow superior to you, when the truth is exactly the opposite. You've made me a better man than I ever was before I met you." "How can you say that, eh?" "Because you've taught me what really matters," Edward said, taking her hands in his as he had so many times before. "You've shown me that worth isn't determined by birth or fortune, but by how we treat others, how we face adversity, how we choose to live our lives. You've reminded me that being a duke is about serving others, not being served by them." As they stood together in the ballroom where they had just celebrated their wedding, Grace felt a deep sense of completion, as though all the scattered pieces of her life had finally fallen into place. She was no longer Grace Thornton, the vicar's daughter without prospects. She was Grace Ravensshire, Duchess of Ravensshire, beloved wife of a man who saw her true worth. The months that followed their wedding brought both challenges and triumphs, as Grace settled into her new role and society gradually adjusted to the reality of a duchess who had earned her position through love rather than birth. There were still those who whispered behind fans about the inappropriateness of the match, but their voices were increasingly drowned out by those who praised Grace's intelligence, grace, and genuine warmth. Grace threw herself into her new responsibilities with the same determination that had carried her through years of adversity. She learned to manage the vast household at Ravensmoor Park, to entertain foreign dignitaries with confidence and charm, and to navigate the complex world of court politics with skill that surprised even her harshest critics. But perhaps most importantly, she used her position to help others who had been overlooked or dismissed by society. She established schools for the children of servants, created employment opportunities for women without family support, and became a patron of various charitable organizations that served those whom society had forgotten. "You've become exactly the Duchess I knew you could be," Lady Margaret told her during one of their regular visits, as they sat in Grace's elegant sitting room at Ravensmoor Park, surrounded by correspondence from grateful recipients of her charitable efforts. "I had excellent teachers," Grace replied with a smile. "And more importantly, I had people who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." The greatest triumph came 2 years after their wedding, when Grace gave birth to their first child, a son who would one day inherit the dukedom and carry on the family name. The Dowager Duchess, who had maintained her opposition to the marriage despite its obvious success, finally relented when faced with the reality of her grandson, arriving at Ravensmoor Park with tears in her eyes and apologies on her lips. "I was wrong," she admitted to Grace as she held her grandson for the first time. "I let my prejudices blind me to your worth, and I'm ashamed of the way I treated you. Can you forgive a foolish old woman who thought she knew better than her son's heart?" "There's nothing to forgive," Grace replied, with the grace that had always characterized her dealings with those who had wronged her. "You were protecting your family as you thought best. I understand that, and I hope we can build a relationship based on our shared love for Edward and this beautiful child." 5 years later, the gardens of Ravensmoor Park were alive with the sound of children's laughter as 4-year-old James Ravensmoor chased his 2-year-old sister Margaret through the maze of perfectly manicured flower beds, their delighted squeals echoing across the grounds where their parents had first declared their love for each other. Grace, now 31 and every inch the Duchess she had never imagined she could become, watched from her favorite bench beneath the ancient oak tree, one hand resting on her rounded belly where their third child grew. "They have your energy," Edward observed, settling beside her with the afternoon correspondence, his steel blue eyes warm with contentment as he watched their children play. "And your determination to explore every corner of the world around them." "They have your curiosity," Grace replied, leaning against her husband's shoulder with the comfortable intimacy of a couple whose love had only deepened with time. "Did you see James this morning, insisting that the gardener explain exactly how roses grow, and Margaret trying to teach the stable cat to curtsy properly? They're going to change the world, those two," Edward said with satisfaction, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of Grace's head, just like their mother did. The transformation in both their lives over the past 7 years had been nothing short of remarkable. Grace had grown into her role as Duchess with a grace and intelligence that had gradually won over even their harshest critics, while Edward had discovered that marriage to a woman who challenged him intellectually and supported him emotionally had made him not just happier, but more effective in all his endeavors. "The Queen has accepted our invitation to the charity gala," Grace announced, sorting through the correspondence with practiced efficiency. "Her Majesty specifically mentioned her admiration for the work we've done with the schools for servants' children." "Excellent," Edward replied with satisfaction. "And what news from Parliament about the education reform bill?" "Lord Melbourne says it will pass by a comfortable margin," Grace said with pride. "He credits our lobbying efforts with changing several key minds about the importance of providing education to all children, regardless of their parents' station." The Ravensmoor Foundation for Educational Equality had become Grace's greatest passion, a revolutionary organization that provided schooling and opportunities for children who had been overlooked by society due to their humble origins. What had begun as Grace's personal mission to ensure that no child would face the limitations she had experienced had grown into a nationwide movement that was changing how society viewed education and opportunity. "Your mother's letter arrived as well," Edward said, pulling an envelope from the stack with a smile. "She's planning to visit next month and wants to know if James is old enough to begin learning about estate management." Grace laughed, thinking of the woman who had once been her greatest opponent and had become one of her closest allies. "She's determined to make up for lost time with her grandchildren." "As she should be," Edward said warmly. "Mother's acceptance of you has been one of the greatest gifts of our marriage. It proved that even the most entrenched prejudices can be overcome by love and patience." As the sun began to set over the gardens of Ravensmoor Park, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, the Duke and Duchess held each other close and marveled at the life they had built together. Their children would grow up understanding that worth was measured by character rather than birth, that love was more powerful than prejudice, and that courage could indeed change the world. "Do you ever think about that day in the library?" Grace asked softly, remembering the moment when their eyes had first met over a fallen book. "Every day," Edward replied with tender honesty. "I think about how close I came to missing the greatest blessing of my life because I was too focused on society's expectations to see what was right in front of me. And I think about how close I came to accepting a life of invisibility because I thought that was all someone like me deserved," Grace added. "Edward, you didn't just marry me, you saved me from disappearing entirely." "We saved each other," Edward corrected gently. "Grace, you taught me what real nobility looks like, what genuine worth means. Without you, I would have remained a duke in title only, never understanding what it truly means to serve others." As they sat together in the garden where their love had first bloomed, Grace reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from a servant's quarters to the highest ranks of society. She had been a woman without a dowry, without connections, without any of the qualifications that society deemed necessary for a duchess. But she had possessed something far more valuable, a heart capable of great love and the courage to believe that she deserved happiness. Their love story had become legendary throughout England, inspiring countless other couples to follow